So I think that a thing that gets left out of the technical discussion, or people that are too focused on the medium exchange element, is that they don't consider the importance of optionality. It's in some ways the middle ground between the cases, in the sense that cash balances are very important, but part of what makes that cash balance useful is the overall liquidity and the overall number and geographic breadth of the conversion points in which I could use Bitcoin. And as long as those numbers keep going up, that there's more liquidity, not just in dollar markets, but in many markets around the world. The more people learn about Bitcoin, the more people realize they would like some, the more people that then they like it so much they want to build on top of it, or they want to educate others about it. That network effect is very powerful, and there's no clear thing that would end it other than some sort of disastrous bug or something like that. Or, I think one of the biggest setbacks would be if the US government kind of like went to the mattresses on Bitcoin, you could damage the liquidity of it severely for a long period of time. But it's not even clear that that would be enough. Like eventually it could even route around that problem. It would just kind of be like a temporary setback, most likely. And one model that I use is that when you have emerging market currencies start to fail, they get dollarized from the bottom up against their will, right? So if Argentina is in a constant currency spiral, more and more Argentinians are going to hold dollars, gold, dollar stable coins, Bitcoin, whatever the case may be. They're going to hold something else. And they can try to add frictions, like they can try to make it harder to send money to exchanges, but people can still use peer-to-peer stuff. That the bigger the incentive, the bigger they're more likely to work around those frictions to get out of the problem. And so basically, the dollar is this predator for every emerging market currency that starts to fail. The dollar is like right there, just always over them, always kind of like with a knife to their neck, ready to jump in should they start to either let down their capital controls or start to have such an inflationary problem that people gravitate towards it more. And when we look at the developed market currencies, including the dollar, they're on a similar trajectory as the emerging markets. It's just there's so much more of a capital base. There's such stronger network effects that it's still kind of trending in the same general direction. So we've had 40 years of falling interest rates, 40 years of rising debt as a percentage of GDP, and those falling interest rates have offset the rising debt as a percentage of GDP. So if you double your debt but you cut your interest rate in half, your interest expenses are still manageable. They haven't really changed. And so that's the position that the US and a lot of these other countries have been in. But now we're at a time where interest rates have hit zero. They were zero for a while. They're bouncing off of zero. The fiscal situation is getting worse because a lot of it's tied to demographics. So they didn't really account for that. So that's all worsening at a time when interest rates are no longer falling. And so as these developed market currencies, I think in the long run trend somewhat, directionally similar to what we've seen in emerging markets, just more overall monetized fiscal deficits that no politician really knows how to control. Bitcoin is like the predator that's always out there, ready to absorb and kind of monetize from the bottom up. And the worse it gets, the more people are going to be willing to overcome frictions. Right now in the developed world, people are not really willing to overcome frictions because it's workable enough. But the worse things get, as we see in emerging markets, the more people gravitate. And Chain Analysis has they call it the crypto adoption index because they don't segment which asset people are holding. But it's like when you look at countries ranked by how much people use quote unquote crypto, 18 out of 19 of the top 20 are emerging markets. The only other two were like the US and the UK. And it's no surprise. Basically, the ones with the worst monetary environment that are tech savvy, that have access to the technology and the interest to do so, they're the ones that are early adopters of Bitcoin and stable coins, whatever the case may be, because they have the most frictions. And so I think that in the intermediate term, the dollar is having a lot of inroads, thanks to stable coins, but the dollar itself is also on an unsustainable path. And Bitcoin's always there to do to the dollar what the dollar is currently doing to other countries.
Exactly. And I think it's remarkable that people who see the bullish case for the dollar can't see the bullish case for Bitcoin often, because it's just the same thing. If you're in Argentina, it's very hard to make pesos. It's very easy to make pesos. It's very hard to make dollars. Well, it's even harder to make Bitcoin, and it's harder to make Bitcoin than in the US. And the US is definitely abusing its exorbitant privilege, as the French used to call it, of printing money. So you would expect, if the US had a sort of responsible monetary policy where their money supply was growing at, let's say, 1 or 2% per year only, you would have seen enormous dollar appreciation over the past 10, 20 years, just because everybody in the world, as the world globalized, as you were saying, with the stable coins, just the bullish case for holding dollars rather than holding your local shitcoin is enormous all over the world. And you would see that reflected on the dollar price. And the reason you don't is because the US government and its banking cartels are eating up all of that monetary premium that would be accruing to dollar holders otherwise. But that's a deeply structural issue that I don't think can be fixed in any meaningful way. There's no way to curb this process from continuing. Tell us about your ideas on free banking and central banking, Chapter 7. What's your thesis there?
So there, what I did was kind of catalog the centralizing forces over time. Well, you start with custodying, then you get to free banking, then you get to central banking. And a challenge and this is why Bitcoin's interesting too, is that when you have banks as basically honeypots, where that's where the gold is, that's what people are using as their ledger. The government only has to go, depending on the size of the country, the government only has to go to a couple dozen banks or a couple hundred banks, and they've got the gold now, they've got the control now. Basically, the number of enforcement points is low, and therefore it's capturable, it's centralizable. Whereas the reason that Bitcoin's interesting is that the enforcement point is now on the individual, right? If they want to impose and say you can't have Bitcoin, well, you've got to do it on the individual level now, which is costly and kind of puts your cards on the table if you're the government. Like instead of, a lot of things can be controlled by just controlling the banks and people don't really know what's going on. But if you go after someone for using Bitcoin or something like that, or using stable coins in another country, that's the government being more transparent about their intentions. They're basically saying you can't, that's information we don't want you to have. And so when we look at that chapter on free banking and central banking, basically we have this like almost like when you read that chapter, it's like watching a frog get boiled slowly, like that common saying where like they don't know what's happening, where like every step of the way you kind of chip away one more piece of centralization. And so you start with basically a good underlying structure of money. So the government just defines a unit of account for money, it mints some coins, but banks are able to, any bank can basically form itself, hold the gold, offer banknotes. Now, I do talk about the perils of fractional reserve banking in one of the chapters. But basically, these institutions are now trying to compete. But then over time, as they inevitably run into liquidity crises from fractional reserve banking, or as the government needs to finance itself for war and has the ability to go after these honeypots, it just starts centralizing them over time. And so, unseen to people that are using these ledgers, the ledger that ties them all together is being more and more controlled in a way that most people are just, most people are not financial experts. And especially in that day, information traveled more slowly. So most people don't know the underlying things that are happening to the banks that centralizing them more and more. And we kind of see that like they just gravitate together under government control towards this like fully controlled centralized ledger. And then one of the outcomes there is that whole ledger becomes highly surveillable. Because if you have non-inflationary money, like if you have gold-backed money, and people can either hold gold or they can hold banknotes that are redeemable for gold and don't really inflate that much, they can engage in a lot of private transactions or have private holdings. Whereas when you have highly inflationary money, people need the yield to manage how quickly they get diluted. They have to mitigate how quickly they get diluted. They need that yield. So it pulls more resources into the banking system, which is controllable by the government. And then everybody's on this surveillable ledger now. And that's been the tendency. It's almost like this black hole, and almost every country's gone through it. I use the American case because that's the one I'm most researched on. And you just see this kind of centralizing force over time. And that's actually part of why I view the technology angle as, I don't want to say deterministic, but having a very big deterministic element to it at least, which is that it's like that the phrase of like the narrow path, right? There's the path of failure is very wide. The path, all the ways it could be centralized given time are very wide. Whereas the path of not having that happen, like if a whole culture said, okay, we're going to set up all of our banks, we're going to do full reserve banking, commodity credit, not circulation credit. Sure, that like utopian society could do like resist this structure, but all the kind of incentives and the technology that enabled it kept pulling towards a more and more centralized and surveillable ledger. And then another thing that I didn't really cover in that chapter, but with that centralized ledger comes income taxes, because, or at least it makes them more widely enforceable, because with widespread financial surveillance is where you get the ability and the desire, and then it becomes normalized that you surveil everybody's, like accounting their entire year and then take a percentage of it. Whereas in those older eras where you had a more distributed and more private monetary structure, income was a less easy thing to tax, right? Because it's harder to surveil everyone's life in that arrangement. And so taxes had to be placed on just more transparent things on average, or more uniform ways. And so it kind of, the technology both centralizes in that era and then also shapes just how politics works, how public finances work, and what our kind of baseline expectations for privacy are. And a lot of it was just not apparent to the people at the era. It's always like you're replacing a ship one plank at a time, and after 100 years, it's a completely different ship.
It's a rocket ship.
Yeah.
Okay, so obviously the book makes a lot of good points about why money is broken, the problems of the current monetary system around the world. And of course, we've spoken a little bit so far about how Bitcoin improves and all of those things. Tell us more about it. We could never get enough Bitcoin propaganda here at the Bitcoin Standard podcast. So why does Bitcoin fix the money?
I think the biggest reason it fixes it is because, as we discussed, it pierces the 160 different currency borders in a more effective way than we've seen before. And it's really the first viable solution to have fast settlements that are also decentralized, and that no one can just arbitrarily inflate it, no one can arbitrarily censor it.